put all the bells in here, and they're like, man. All right. So today we are continuing our worship series called Autobiography, where we're looking at our stories, our own stories with God, our own stories of our lives, and what we may learn from them. And we're doing it through this lens of Paul's letters because Paul was really good at a lot of things. And one of the things that Paul did was record a lot of what was going on with him and his life into the letters that he wrote. So between kind of the last half of the book of Acts, which is mostly about Paul and his travels, and what we gain from his letters, we have a pretty good understanding of where Paul was and what he did and where he taught and who he was in conversation with, more so than really anybody else from that first century time. None of the disciples, none of the rest of it. We have a okay idea what happened with them. But we have a really good understanding about what happened with Paul because Paul liked nothing more than writing about Paul. He did. And so here we have his letter to Philippi, the city in Philippi, the church in Philippi, which is one of the churches that he helped found. It was a community that he went to and brought to them this message, this news, this understanding about Jesus. And Philippi is an important place for a lot of reasons. Where it exists on the map is it exists in a place where a lot of trade flows through. So it was really important for that. It was strategically important to the Roman Empire. And because of that, it enjoyed a lot of privileges. Most people who lived in Philippi were citizens of Rome, which is a big deal. And so it was an important place, and one that Paul obviously had a particular bit of kindness towards. Now, he's writing him this letter, and the occasion for him writing him a letter, usually when Paul writes a letter, it's because something bad has happened, right? And that's one of the games we get to play with Paul's letters, is we get to read through what he says and then I wonder what happened that Paul thought he needed to say this, right? You know, it's a bit like hearing only the parent side of a conversation between parent and children, right? I wonder what this child did that this mother is saying this in the middle of the Safeway store, right? Obviously something not great. Most of Paul's letters are like that. He's writing to them because something has gone astray and he needs to set them right. That is not the case with the letter to Philippians, or the Philippians letter. Mostly he's writing to them because he can. There is a messenger, somebody who has brought something to Paul and is ostensibly going to go back. And if they're going to do that, he might as well write a letter to go back. Because remember, the post office doesn't exist yet. You can't send an e-card or e-greeting. None of that exists. So if you have the opportunity to communicate, it doesn't come often. You might as well take the opportunity to do that. So he decides to write them a letter. And it's actually a really nice one. It's full of a lot of encouragement. And he also needs to say thank you, because the reason that the messenger is there is that they brought something for him. And we are reading, if you've noticed, if you look at where we are in the book, we're actually towards the very end, and he's basically giving his final greetings. And one of the things he's doing is he's saying, thank you for the support you sent me. And then he says, your guys are really the only ones who do that. Right? So he said that right there. You guys are the only ones that do that. Even when I was in other towns and other cities, working with other churches, you're the ones that actually sent me stuff. Now, the detail that he leaves out in his thank you letter back is part of the reason why that is true is because Paul wouldn't let anybody else do that. In fact, he specifically references Thessalonica in this passage. If you go and read Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, he tells them flat out, you offered me stuff, but I didn't take it. Right? And he says the same thing to the Corinthians. He says the same things to other people. In those places, he was really concerned that if he had taken something from them, they would have thought, oh, Paul's just in it for the money. Right? Because apparently being a traveling evangelist in the first century was where all the money was. No, it was not. Much like working today, all the money's working for the church. No. But so he actually, the one place he was willing to receive support from was this church. Now, the other thing that's really interesting, and it goes by quick and you can miss it, but it's actually really, really important, and it's one little verse that actually tells you a whole lot about Paul and the way Paul thinks, is when he's thanking them for their support, and he says, thank you, I want to receive your support. He basically goes on to say, not that I really needed it, right? I thank you for your support, not that I really needed it, but what I'm grateful for, and if you translate kind of a little bit of what he says there, he talks about something being credited to their account. What he's basically saying is, what I'm grateful for is I know it makes you feel good to give it to me, right? That's basically what he's saying. It's like, I don't really need what you're sending me, but I know it makes you feel good, and it's good for you to have done that, so I'm glad to provide you that opportunity to give, is what he's saying. He's saying, it's so important that you have the opportunity to give that I'm willing to receive, even though I don't really need it. Now, what makes this actually super more interesting, too, is once you realize where Paul is when he's saying this. So when Paul is saying, thank you for what you sent, I appreciate that you really felt good about saying it. You know, my needs are all met. God's taking care of me. Where Paul is sitting in the moment where this, obviously nobody actually took a picture, but that this thing is supposed to be depicting is Paul's in prison. Paul is writing this letter from prison because in another place he has been, he got in trouble, as Paul is also wont to do, Paul got in trouble for a lot of reasons, but a lot of it was this idea of stirring up crowds and all those things he got in trouble for. Paul is in prison, writing to these people, I'm fine. Everything's fine. I'm fine. All my needs are met in prison, but thank you, is basically what he's saying. This is a very odd thing. Most of us would not have that response. First off, most of us have probably not been to prison, I would assume. But, things happen. Life happens. I've had plenty of congregants that have. But we can probably relate to that idea of being somewhere maybe we don't want to be, or having to do something we don't want to do, and some help comes our way. I don't know that this would be our response. And what this kind of helps us understand is it helps us really understand where Paul is coming from. What Paul gave, the gift that Paul gave the early church and gave us today, and the reason we keep his letters around, is that Paul really brought a different sense of understanding, and he really brought a sense of philosophy to the Christian faith. While the Gospels record a lot of the story of Jesus and what Jesus did and how he acted, and inspire us in that way, Paul was really the early church thinker who kind of added this philosophical layer on top of it. And the philosophy that Paul was really interested in the time, which a lot of people at the time were, was this philosophy of Stoicism. So you ever heard about somebody being called Stoic, like that's a Stoic person? Like that comes from something, and it comes from this philosophical disposition of Stoicism, which really had its origins in like 3rd century BC, but then was really popular during Paul's time as well. There was this real rediscovery of it. And I know you're all really excited that we're going to dive deep into 3rd century philosophy. I can see the smiles on your faces. Sometimes when I'm doing my research on this, I just get so excited about something like, I'm going to talk about this and I don't care. All right. So Stoic philosophy is actually not really unlike in many ways, and actually the tenets are actually fairly similar in many ways to Buddhist philosophy, which was growing in the East about the same time. And it's important, honestly, for us to understand this because this is the place that Paul is writing from. And a lot of the ideas that get embedded into Christianity in terms of like philosophy and theology come from this place of Stoicism because that's what Paul and a lot of the thinkers at the time were into. So Stoicism has a lot of kind of antecedents that kind of lead to it. One of the big kind of early thinkers that is credited with kind of starting off this whole movement was a guy you probably heard of called Plato, right? Now I know what I think of when I think of Plato. I think of my grandma's house, and we're not allowed to mix the red and the green or you get in real trouble. That was a big rule growing up. Or downstairs on the preschool. I always love going downstairs on the preschool on Play-Doh day. But this is a different Plato. This is an actual guy. And Plato talked about a lot of things, but one of the things Plato talked about was this idea of the four virtues. And he had these four virtues that he would kind of proclaim in most things. And those virtues were wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice. And of course, you can think, if you really think about Paul and his letters or Christian faith and all that kind of stuff, these are all things that, of course, even today, 2,000 years later, we would affirm, right? And we would say, yeah, those are good things. It's good to be wise. It is good to be courage. It's good to have moderation in life. And, of course, it is good to seek justice. It's part of what we do. And how Plato talked about this being lived out, and how Stoic philosophers talked about this being lived out, was the idea was you were supposed to be less concerned about external events, basically. The idea is more or less, don't worry so much about things you can't control, right? Don't worry about so much about those things that are out of your hands. Don't worry about the external events that happen in the world. Be concerned about what you actually can do. Be concerned about your personal actions and be concerned a little less about what happens to you and be much more concerned about how you respond to what happens. That was really the beginning and the most important thing about the Stoic idea. And a person's job was basically improvement. We were supposed to improve our ethical and moral behavior. And we did that by being in agreement with nature and or God. There was this idea that there is a God of the whole universe, and it is not you. Sorry. Not me either. Right? There are things that will happen in life that you are not in charge of and can't really affect. The challenge is identifying those things you can and making sure that you do all that you can to respond well to whatever comes your way. So the idea is basically, instead of saying, being lost in this idea of woe is me for all of these terrible things, concentrate yourself on and give yourself, make your focus of what you do, how am I going to respond to these things that happen to me in life? So if we understand that as kind of the basic precept of what's going on, how Paul is acting and behaving in this moment starts to make more sense. Because he's not in charge of him being in prison, right? He didn't voluntarily check in, right? At the end of the day, it's not really going to be up to him whether he gets out. So he's making a choice to concentrate on other things. Now, there was a very popular philosopher of the day known as Seneca the Younger. And Seneca the Younger was well known at the time of Jesus and Paul and was one of the more popular philosophers going. And he had a lot of things to say. He wrote a lot. But I just wanted to share a couple of quotes that kind of give you the flavor of what it is that he was talking about. And I love this one first. It says, "It's not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it." Like it sounds like it belongs in a fortune cookie too, but there's a lot, there's wisdom there, right? Like, oh yeah, that's the thing. How long we live at the end of the day usually isn't up to us, but what we do with the days we have is. Right? So you can kind of see that Stoic philosophy there. The next one is, we suffer more in imagination than in reality. Right? I know this every time I go to the dentist. Right? I fear going to the dentist and I dislike going to the dentist in my mind. It's far more unpleasant in my mind than it is when we actually get there. And thank you, Candy's daughter, for taking such good care of me when I go to the dentist. But we do, right? We often anticipate uncomfortable things. We anticipate uncomfortable conversations. We anticipate difficult situations. The pain we feel in the anticipation is often far worse than the reality of the moment itself. And then the next thing he says is, as long as you live, keep learning how to live. As long as, and I like this quote because it's very similar to what we talk about here, right? When we talk about this idea of becoming more, so long as we draw breath, so long as we are still here, God is still calling to us to, one, be loved as we are, but also to become more than we are, right? This idea that we're all on this path and our story continues. So long as we are here, our story will continue. As long as you keep learning how to live. And then finally, I thought this quote, ignorance is the cause of fear, right? This kind of goes along with the other one, right? At the end of the day, what we really, really fear more than anything are things we don't understand. Now, if you were like me, then some of these thoughts and ideas that that he is expressing may sound a little familiar to you. And of course, there are modern Stoic philosophers, and I think the most popular modern Stoic philosophers we know and have around today are these two. At the end of the day, Yoda and Spock are pretty much. I have to remember that some people just watch this, listen to this on the podcast. They don't. They just spend 10 seconds like, I wonder why they're laughing. So, for those who only listen to the audio, there's a picture of Yoda and Spock up there because, of course, there is. But really, in many ways, it's kind of the same thing, right? I mean, every generation kind of rediscovers this. And in case you need examples, because you knew this was coming, we have these wonderful quotes like there's one from Yoda. Attachment leads to jealousy, the shadow of greed, the shadow of greed, that is. Train yourself to let go of everything you fear to lose. Yeah, sounds very Seneca. All right, and then, of course, from our good friend, Mr. Spock, you may find that having is not so much pleasing a thing after all as wanting. It is not logical, but it is often true. Sometimes having the thing that we want doesn't feel as good as we expect it to. That is the wanting. So we can start to understand where Paul is coming from. We can start to understand why Paul is saying the things that he is to them and what it is that he's concentrating on. He's not really being, at first reading, we may think Paul's trying to be a bit martyry, right? Like, oh, don't worry about me, I'm fine. Thanks for what you sent, I'm okay, right? That's not what he's doing, in fact. What he's doing is he's being a really good Stoic. He's looking around and saying, I'm not in charge if I'm in prison. I'm not in charge of this. I'm not in charge of all of that, right? And yet when this person comes from this people that he cares about, bearing a message and some support, right, he has an opportunity to choose how he's going to respond to that. He can respond to it, oh my gosh, where have you been, right? I've been sitting here for days. Or he can be grateful for the grace and peace that came through his door. And the other part of that is the thing that he talks about being grateful for is actually true, right? He recognizes, as most of us today recognize, that when we have the opportunity to give, when we have an opportunity to support someone who's going through struggles, when we have an opportunity like we have every time we gather here to hear each other's joys and concerns and pray for each other, if we're honest and we're doing it right, we would recognize that when we get that opportunity to give and give to others and support others, that does feel good. There's something wired inside of us. There's something that God put inside of us that when we sacrifice not for ourselves but for others, when we do things on behalf of others, more often than not, if we're doing it right, it actually feels good to do it. So when Paul says, I am grateful for this because I know you are getting credited to your account, he's basically, I'm grateful to receive this because I know you're happy to give it. Paul means that in the truest sense of the term. He does trust and believe that the part of the reason he's willing to accept from the Philippians in a way he's not willing to accept from others is he has confidence that they're actually giving out of their heart. They're supporting him out of their love for him and his love back to them. And he knows that they feel good about their ability to support him, and he is grateful to give them that opportunity to feel good. This can play out in our own lives in many different ways, sometimes in big ways and sometimes in small ways. Now, about 10 years ago now, as I've talked about many times, I had the opportunity to visit our United Methodist brothers and sisters in Angola. As part of the reason we do the work we do with them now is that connection I have with them. And part of honestly, we got to do a lot of things while we were there. One of the things we got to do is drink really, really small coffee because that's apparently how they serve it. So it was delicious, and it'll keep you up. So if you're dealing with a 6-hour, 8-hour, 9-hour time change, whatever it was, that's the ticket for you right there. But really, honestly, while we were there, we were meeting with pastors and other people down there, and they would ask us all these questions when we got here. And one of the questions that usually would come up in some form or another is, why are you here? Right? Like, why did you come? Because the expectation was we came, oftentimes when people from, the U.S. visit there, they come and maybe they teach classes, or things like that. And there was a sense of like, what did you come to do? Are you going to teach a class while you're here? Are you going to help us, what are you going to do? And we had this really weird response to them. It's like, well, actually, we came to learn. We came to hear from you. We came to hear the stories about what's going on here and in your life. Actually, no, previous one. We'll get to this one. But we wanted to go. We wanted to learn from you about what's going on. And it would take a little while for them to figure out what we meant by that. And I said, and the idea was, and it took us a while to figure out why this was such where the challenge was. And the challenge was, in their minds, their assumption was, if we were coming from the United States, that we had it all figured out, right? That's how that was their understanding of the United States, is that, oh, you're from the United States where everything is perfect and going wonderfully. And I'm like, wow, really? Do you guys not have TV? I'm pretty sure you do, but that was the expectation. And the part of it was, and we were the place where the money came from and we had support and all those sorts of things. So they just sort of generally figured out that, we had church figured out and we knew how to do church well. And a part of our role to be there was to teach them how to do church the way that we do church, because that was obviously the right way. And it took us a while to help explain. It's like, no. We do church the way that we do church in the place that we do church. But this is not that place. Right? You guys live in a different world than we live in. You have different opportunities and understandings than we have, do. So we're here actually not to teach you how to do things the right way. We come here assuming God is already at work in this place, that the Holy Spirit's already at work in this place. We want to learn about what you're doing and where God is working here, so that, not so we can impart all of our great wisdom onto you, because I'm not sure we have that to give, but we want to learn the wisdom that you have to share with us, because we think you have some. And that would usually lead to some awkward silence for a while, and then eventually to some really exciting conversations, where people would slowly start to share where things are happening, what they're doing, all this stuff for them that they take for granted and just say, well, this is how you do it, and everybody knows this is how you do it. And we would be sitting there like frantically scribbling notes like the whole time, right? Because we'd ask them, like, how do you guys meet? Like, how are you meeting new people? What are you doing? How are you outreaching to your community? And they would just talk about this. I still remember this conversation. I remember to the day I die, this conversation with this one pastor who was in a very rural context. And of course, in our part of the world, we've got a lot of rural churches, but a lot of rural context. He's a very rural pastor, and rural Angola is like rural Montana. Like, it's for real rural. Not that fake East Coast rural where they used to talk about rural ministry, and I'm like, you're still like 20 minutes from like a Walmart. That's not rural. But they got real rural the way we have real rural. Ooh, say that 5 times. I remember us talking about it. He's like, well, what do you mean? And it's like, well, how do you meet people? It's like, well, we meet them. Like, well, what do you mean? Like, well, we go to, like, we leave the church and we go to where the people are, and we meet them. And like, well, how do you meet them? Like, well, they kept looking at me like, well, what do you mean? And I'm like, what do you do? Like, we go and we talk and we meet their name. We learn their names and we learn what's going on with them, and we learn the name of their children. And, then we go back next week and we do it again. And then we go back next week and we do it again. We go and we actually meet people where they are at. And for most of us, we probably say, okay, I get that, except when you add in this other layer that they deal with that we don't, it becomes even more impressive, because what you recognize is by the time we were there, they were 10 years away from their civil war, and the Civil War drew a lot of lines, and one of the lines that it drew a line between the people who lived in the villages and the people who didn't. And oftentimes the people who lived in the villages were on a different side of the conflict from the people who didn't. So when they talk about going out, they are talking about as the people who live in the villages, going out into the place where the people who didn't live in the villages were, and going and being with them, having conversation with them, learning their names. And he talked about it. Yeah, he's like, yeah. And I'm like, and we talked about, well, how do you do that? And he's like, now it's not so bad. It was kind of hard 10 years ago when the World War first ended. And he's like, well, what? And we're like, what do you mean? He's like, well, 10 years ago, we actually had to go with UN peacekeepers. So in order for them to go and reach people, to bring the good news in a new way to new people they hadn't met. He's like, yeah, but it's the understanding but they're like, but that's what the pastor does. That's what the pastor does. That's their job. It's the job of the pastor and the lay leader, who always went to Chris, to go out and meet people. And if it's not safe, you take somebody with you to help make it safe, or at least a little safer. But what else were we supposed to do? We met them where they were. And then as time went on and relationships get built, sometimes they would come in and join us. And sometimes we would go and set up a new worship there. If they weren't comfortable coming to us, then we would go there. And we're frantically scribbling. And they're looking at us like, why are you writing that down? Isn't that obvious? We're like, well, we come from a different place. We're dealing with different things. And it was so exciting to watch these folks and get the opportunity to share. They had been on the receiving end for a long time. They had received our financial support. They had received our prayers. They had received. By going there and being with them, they were given an opportunity to give back. They were given an opportunity to inspire the few of us that got to go. They got to bless me with that story that hopefully I'm now blessing you with. They got an opportunity to give, and they were really excited to give. And they were really excited to know that they had something to give, because they did. They had an amazing story, and actually many, many amazing stories about how God was working in their midst. And I will probably preach on those stories until the day I die, because they left such an impression on me and the other people that got to go. We went there at great time and cost and expense. And one of the things that we were able to do, amongst a lot of things we were able to do, was give them an opportunity to give back. And because they did, and they were willing to do it, and they were willing to be in conversation with us, even though they didn't understand necessarily why they were doing it, we were both blessed. A couple of years before, I had a similar situation right here back in the good old US of A. My church that I was serving at the time had this program called Wonderful Wednesdays, where we had a free meal, gave a free meal to people, and then there was a food pantry. And one of the things that happened is I became the pastor of that church the summer of 2008. Now, if you don't remember, something happened the summer of 2008, in the fall of 2008 and into 2009. I think we call it the Great Recession now. And one of the consequences of that was this Wednesday night program went from being a place where maybe 30 or 40 people gathered to receive the free meal and then go through the food pantry, to a place where about 150 people gathered. A lot of them were families that lived in the area. A lot of them were families at risk of losing their housing, people that we had never seen before. And when I sat down to talk to them, I realized that not only had we never seen them before, they have never been in that situation before. They'd never had to ask for that help before. And they would come and they would feel, not very good about having to ask for the help. And I would sit and talk with them, and they would say to me over and over again, how they were struggling and how they felt, like they struggled because they couldn't help their families and all this sort of stuff. And they would talk about how, we always meant to volunteer more before, and we never really did. Now I'm feeling bad because here I am taking, and I've never volunteered before. The other thing that happened because of how much more we had to do is we had to go find more help. It exceeded what our little church's ability. This is a church of about 40 people on a Sunday, so it exceeded our ability to do. So we had to go find other partner churches to partner with. So we brought in new volunteers. And what was fascinating was to have conversations with those two groups throughout the evening. On one hand, you have people who were feeling terrible about themselves because they had to ask for help. And then in the other place, the people cooking the food and providing the food, doing all that kind of stuff, were feeling really grateful for an opportunity to serve. They knew what was going on in the world around them. They knew whatever people were struggling and dealing with stuff. Most of them were not in a situation that is really affecting them or not affecting them yet. And here they were, excited to be there to have an opportunity to give. Those who were sacrificing, it would seem, were feeling wonderful. those who were struggling, the ones who were struggling were the ones that receive. I think many of us fall into this same place and can fall into this same mindset where we are excited to give of what we have. We are excited to serve others. We are excited to get an opportunity to bless others because we've been blessed. And at the same time, we hate like anything having to ask anybody for help, right? We're willing to give. Many of us are willing to give, and we struggle, and I'm speaking to myself here, we struggle to ask for the help when we need it. What Paul wants us to understand is when we do put ourselves in that position, when we do allow ourselves to ask for the help that we need, oftentimes what we are doing is we are creating a situation where, one, we can be blessed by having our needs met, and somebody else can be blessed by getting to meet that need. When we think about writing down, it's one of the things we've asked you to do this week, or doing this whole Lent thing, is write down the stories of our lives, to write our autobiography. One of the things that we have to reconcile in our head is those places that we may write down as low moments, those moments in which we felt like we weren't enough or had to rely on others or ask for help, those moments where we may have some guilt or shame around. That exact moment, somebody may be writing down in their book as a time of a great win, a time when they got to do some good, a time when they got to bless others. I don't know for many of us that the struggle doesn't tend to be finding people who are willing to give. The struggle tends to be about putting ourselves in the position to receive when we need to receive. And yet, when we do, when we are willing to ask and accept for the help when it is offered, we are creating this amazing opportunity. It's the opportunity that Paul had in prison. It's the opportunity we have today. We get to create an opportunity where everybody gets to feel blessed. We get to feel blessed in knowing there was somebody loved and cared and was willing to give to us, to support us, and that person gets blessed by the giving. That's what Paul is writing about in this letter. He's not actually ungrateful for what he received. He's very grateful for what he received. He is also grateful that he knows and trusts that the Philippians are feeling good too. That is the amazing thing. That is one of the things that God put into the world. When we are about to give business of giving and receiving, everybody gets blessed if we allow it to be. So let us write our story, our good story about good days. Good days when, yes, we were able to give, and good days when we were blessed to receive. Amen.